The message came through during dinner shift, crackling through every speaker on every human outpost from Mars to the edge of known space. Most people ignored it at first, thinking it was another communication malfunction. Static-filled transmissions were common near the outer rim where solar interference played havoc with equipment, but this static had patterns, rhythms that seemed almost musical. Lieutenant Davis was spooning synthetic beef stew into his mouth when he heard it. The sound made him stop chewing. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the way the static rose and fell, like whale song mixed with electronic noise. He set down his spoon and leaned closer to the wall speaker in the mess hall. The pattern repeated 3 times, then shifted. New sounds emerged from the static. Clicks, whistles, and something that might have been words if words could be made of water and wind. Other crew members stopped eating and gathered around the speaker. Nobody spoke. The alien nature of the transmission was unmistakable. Within hours, every communication array in human space was focused on the signal. Linguists worked around the clock to decode what they were hearing. The breakthrough came from Dr. Wells, a marine biologist who noticed the sounds matched patterns found in Earth's deep ocean creatures. The aliens were aquatic. The translation was rough, but clear enough to chill everyone who heard it. The beings called themselves the Altari, and they were dying. Something was hunting them across the stars, consuming everything in its path. They had sent their message into the void hoping someone, anyone, would answer. Captain Rivers received the decoded transmission while reviewing patrol reports. He read it twice before calling an emergency meeting. The briefing room filled quickly as word spread through the ship. The crew of the UES Defiance had seen plenty of strange things during their deep space missions, but nothing had prepared them for this. The message was simple and terrifying. The Altari spoke of shadow things that ate planets, leaving empty space, where star systems used to be. They described watching their homeworld sun dim and die as something drained it of energy. Billions of their people had perished in the first attacks. The survivors fled in whatever ships they could find, but the most disturbing part came at the end of the message. The Altari had not chosen to contact humanity by chance. Their ancient records spoke of a young species that would rather fight, impossible odds, than surrender. A people who walked alongside death rather than bow to it. They believed humans were that species. Rivers felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he finished reading. The implications were staggering. These aliens had traveled across unknown distances to find humanity specifically because they thought humans were crazy enough to fight something that consumed star systems. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Ensign Blake, barely 22, and fresh from the academy, raised his hand. His voice cracked when he spoke. Could they really ignore a distress call from beings fleeing extinction? Could they turn their backs on an entire species? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rivers looked around the room at faces he had served with for years. These were good people, brave people, but what the Altari were describing was beyond anything in their training manuals. How do you fight an enemy that eats planets? The answer came from an unexpected source. Chief Engineer Rodriguez, a quiet woman who rarely spoke during briefings, stood up slowly. She had been reading the technical data attached to the transmission. The Altari had included star charts showing the path of destruction. Whatever was hunting them was moving in a straight line toward the galactic core, consuming everything in its path. Rodriguez pulled up a holographic display showing known space. She overlaid the Altari data onto human star charts. The projection made everyone in the room step back. If the destruction continued at its current rate, it would reach human space within 2 years. This was not about helping alien refugees anymore. This was about survival. The hunters were already coming for humanity whether they knew it or not. The only question was whether they would meet this threat prepared or be caught off guard like the Altari. Rivers made his decision in that moment. The Defiance would respond to the Altari distress call. They would investigate this threat and hopefully make contact with the survivors. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the right thing to do. The ship changed course 3 hours later, heading toward the coordinates provided in the alien transmission. As they entered hyperspace, Rivers stood in his quarters looking out at the swirling tunnel of distorted space. He wondered if they were flying toward their deaths, but he also knew they had no choice. The journey took 6 days. When they dropped back into normal space, the sensors immediately detected something wrong. The star system the Altari had fled from was still there, but it was dim. The central star burned with barely half its normal brightness, and several planets were simply gone. The Defiance approached carefully, sensors scanning for any signs of life or hostile activity. They found both. A small fleet of organic-looking ships drifted near the outer planets, clearly of alien design. But they also detected something else, something that made the sensor operators double-check their readings. Space itself seemed wounded here. Reality flickered at the edges of the system like a damaged video screen. Gravity readings fluctuated wildly. Even time seemed to flow differently in certain areas, causing chronometers to speed up or slow down without explanation. The alien ships detected their approach and sent a new transmission. This one was clearer than the original distress call, translated in real time by the ship's computer. The voice that emerged from the speakers was melodic but filled with exhaustion and fear. The speaker identified himself as Elder Tide Singer Aquinal, leader of the surviving Altari fleet. He welcomed the humans with gratitude that bordered on religious awe. They had actually come. They had answered the call when no other species in the galaxy had been willing to help. Aquinal's next words made Rivers grip his command chair tighter. The things that had destroyed the Altari homeworld were called the Devourers. They were not just aliens from another world, but something far older and more terrible. They existed between dimensions, feeding on the fabric of reality itself. The Elder's voice grew heavy with sorrow as he explained what his people had witnessed. The Devourers did not simply destroy planets or kill populations. They consumed the very essence of things, unmaking matter at its most basic level. Where they fed, nothing remained but empty void, as if those places had never existed at all. As the two fleets met in the shadow of a dying star system, Rivers realized that humanity had just inherited the galaxy's deadliest enemy. But looking at his crew's determined faces, he also realized something else. The Altari had chosen correctly. When faced with the impossible, humans did indeed refuse to surrender. The real war was about to begin. 3 months after first contact with the Altari, refugee camps filled every available space dock in human territory. The sight of alien families huddled in converted cargo bays had become commonplace, but it never stopped being heartbreaking. Children from a dozen different species played together while their parents worked frantically to decode ancient star maps and technical specifications that might help in the coming fight. Dr. Nova Pierce wiped her tired eyes and stared at the holographic display floating above her desk. The artifact before her was beautiful in its alien geometry, a crystalline structure that seemed to bend light around itself. The Altari had recovered it from their homeworld's oldest temple before fleeing. According to their historians, it predated their civilization by millions of years. The crystal pulsed with soft blue light as Nova ran another scan. Every test revealed new layers of complexity. The material was not quite matter as humans understood it, existing somehow in multiple dimensions simultaneously. More importantly, it contained data. Vast amounts of information compressed into quantum patterns that hurt to look at directly. Nova had been studying builder artifacts for most of her career. These mysterious ruins appeared throughout the galaxy, always in systems that showed signs of ancient catastrophe. Most xenoarchaeologists believed the builders had simply died out naturally. Nova was beginning to suspect something far more sinister had ended their civilization. The breakthrough came at 0347 hours during her 4th consecutive all-nighter. The crystal suddenly blazed with brilliant light, and the holographic display exploded into a 3-dimensional star map unlike anything she had ever seen. This was not just the local galaxy, but something far grander, showing the positions of spiral arms going back millions of years. Red markers indicated points of devastation scattered across time and space. Each marker corresponded to a region where entire star systems had vanished, leaving only empty void. The pattern was unmistakable. The Devourers had been active for eons, systematically consuming civilizations across cosmic time. but there were also green markers scattered throughout the map. These indicated something the builder records called sanctuary worlds or beacon systems, places where the devourers had been fought to a standstill, where reality had somehow been reinforced against their hunger. Nova's hands trembled as she traced the connections between beacon systems. They formed a rough sphere around the galactic core, as if protecting something at the galaxy's heart. At the center of this defensive network was a single golden marker pulsing with urgent light. She called Admiral Stone immediately, despite the early hour. The old soldier arrived in her lab still wearing his sleeping clothes, took one look at the display and started making calls. Within an hour, every major human military leader was crowding into the small research facility. The golden marker represented something the builder records called the final archive. According to the fragmented data Nova had decoded, it was a massive construct hidden in the dangerous space near the galaxy's central black hole. The builders had apparently made their last stand there, though what had happened during that final battle remained unclear. Admiral Stone studied the tactical implications while Nova continued her research. The defensive network of beacon systems had clearly failed eventually, since the builders were gone and the devourers had resumed their galaxy-wide feeding. But the archive itself might still be intact, protected by whatever desperate measures the builders had taken in their final hours. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. If humanity wanted any chance of stopping the devourers, they would need to reach the archive and discover what weapons or knowledge the builders had died protecting. The journey would take them through the most dangerous region of space in the known galaxy. Meanwhile, reports continued pouring in from the Outer Rim colonies. The devourers were advancing faster than anyone had predicted. What had taken months to consume Altari space was now happening in weeks as the entities grew stronger with each feeding. Colony ships fled inward, carrying tales of horror that stretched credibility. Entire moons had been drained of mass in hours, leaving behind shells of exotic matter that collapsed into micro-black holes. Space itself had been wounded in some attacks, creating tears in reality that leaked impossible geometries into normal space. The refugee situation was becoming critical. Human space had never been designed to accommodate millions of displaced beings from dozens of different species. Food riots had broken out on 3 stations. Cultural misunderstandings led to fights between different refugee groups. Some human colonies were demanding that the aliens be relocated elsewhere, anywhere else. But there were also signs of hope. The Altari's bioships had begun integrating with human vessels, their organic hulls proving remarkably adaptive to human technology. The silicon-based granite folk contributed their advanced understanding of dimensional mathematics. The avian skysingers possessed natural quantum sensitivity that allowed them to navigate regions where normal instruments failed. Most importantly, the refugees had brought something humanity lacked: knowledge. Every species had encountered traces of the builders during their development. Ancient ruins, mysterious artifacts, legends of beings who had transcended physical existence to become one with the cosmos itself. Piece by piece, a larger picture emerged. The builders had not been a single species, but rather a coalition of civilizations that had banded together when the devourers first awakened. They had fought a war lasting millions of years, gradually being pushed back toward the galactic core. The final chapters of that war were shrouded in mystery, but one fact emerged clearly from every refugee account. The builders had discovered something at the galaxy's heart that had terrified them more than the devourers themselves. Their last communications spoke of the price of victory and choices that unmake the chooser. Dr. Pierce worked 18-hour days trying to decode more of the builder archive. Each breakthrough revealed new horrors and new possibilities. The builders had developed weapons that attacked the fundamental forces holding reality together. They had created artificial dimensions to hide their civilian populations. In their desperation, they had even begun experimenting with controlled temporal paradoxes. But none of it had been enough. The devourers adapted to every tactic, evolved beyond every weapon. The builder civilization had fallen not through lack of courage or technology, but because they were fighting an enemy that existed partially outside the laws of physics that governed normal matter. The weight of this knowledge settled over human leadership like a shroud. They were not the first to face this threat. Countless civilizations had stood where humanity now stood, armed with advanced technology and desperate courage. All of them had failed, yet the aliens continued to look to humanity with hope that bordered on religious faith. The Altari's prophecies spoke of a species that would embrace the darkness not to become it, but to light the way for others. Other refugee cultures had similar legends, all describing a young race that would succeed where others had failed through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Admiral Stone found himself questioning whether humanity deserved such faith. They were still a relatively primitive species, barely 3 centuries into their space age. Their weapons were crude compared to builder technology, their understanding of cosmic forces elementary at best. But as he watched human engineers working alongside alien refugees to modify ships and weapons, he began to understand what the prophecies might mean. Humanity's advantage was not technological superiority or tactical brilliance. It was something far simpler and more dangerous: the absolute refusal to quit fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The Devourers were about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovably stubborn species. The galaxy held its breath and waited to see which would prove stronger, cosmic hunger or human determination. The decision to attack rather than defend went against every military doctrine in human history. When facing an enemy of unknown strength, the logical response was to build defenses and gather intelligence. But the Devourers gave humanity no time for logical responses. Every day of delay meant another star system consumed, another million lives lost to the growing darkness. Commander Fox stood in the observation deck of the UES Harbinger, watching the largest fleet in human history assemble around the shipyards of Luna Station. 200 vessels from every nation on Earth, supported by twice as many alien ships whose organic curves and crystalline angles made them look more like art than weapons of war. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The Harbinger itself was humanity's desperate gamble made manifest. Built around technologies that barely worked and theories that might be completely wrong, the experimental ship represented 18 months of round-the-clock work by the galaxy's greatest minds. Its weapons were designed not to destroy matter, but to attack the fundamental forces that held reality together at the quantum level. Fox had volunteered for this mission, knowing it was likely suicide. The Harbinger had never been tested at full power because doing so near populated areas might accidentally tear holes in space-time. Its first real combat trial would be against enemies that had already proven immune to conventional weapons. The mixed fleet began moving 3 days later, following course corrections provided by Altari navigators who had mapped the safe passages through Devourer-controlled space. Safe was a relative term. These were regions where reality remained mostly intact, where cause and effect still functioned according to recognizable laws of physics. The journey into contested space began normally enough. Hyperspace travel worked as expected, stars appeared where they should be, and time flowed at its usual rate. But as they pushed deeper into the war zone, strange things began happening that made seasoned spacers question their sanity. Ensign Miller was on watch duty when he noticed his coffee cup aging rapidly while he watched. The liquid inside evaporated in seconds, leaving behind crystals that should have taken decades to form. The cup itself began showing signs of metal fatigue, as if it had been used for centuries rather than hours. Miller reported the incident and learned that similar temporal distortions were happening throughout the fleet. Dr. Wells documented the effects in her research logs. Time was flowing differently in various parts of each ship, creating pockets where minutes stretched into hours or compressed into seconds. Crew members aged at different rates depending on which section they worked in. Some reported experiencing memories of events that had not yet happened, while others forgot things that had occurred moments before. The Altari navigators explained that they were passing through regions where the Devourers had fed recently. Reality itself had been wounded, creating instabilities in the fabric of spacetime. The damage would heal eventually, but the process took decades or centuries depending on how much had been consumed. Navigation became a nightmare as standard instruments gave contradictory readings. Stellar positions shifted randomly. Planets appeared on sensors only to vanish when ships approached for closer examination. The fleet had to rely increasingly on the quantum sensitivity of the Skysinger crews, whose natural abilities allowed them to perceive stable passages through the chaos. 2 weeks into the journey, they encountered their first direct sign of Devourer presence. The Harbinger's sensors detected a massive energy signature ahead, something that registered as both matter and antimatter, while simultaneously being neither. Commander Fox ordered the fleet to maintain maximum distance while deploying long-range observation probes. The probes transmitted back images that would haunt every crew member who saw them. A star system was being consumed in real time. Planets were dissolving like sugar cubes in acid, their matter streaming away into hungry entities that existed partially outside normal space. The central star flickered and dimmed as something drained its nuclear fires. But the most disturbing sight was the Devourers themselves. They appeared as shadows given substance, dark shapes that hurt to look at directly, because they seemed to exist in too many dimensions simultaneously. They moved through space without regard for velocity or momentum, simply appearing wherever they chose to feed. Fox watched one of the entities approach an observation probe. The probe vanished without any visible attack, simply ceasing to exist, as if it had never been built. The Devourer showed no interest in the fleet watching from a safe distance. It was focused entirely on consuming the remaining mass in the star system. The fleet moved carefully around the feeding ground, using the distraction to push deeper into Devourer territory. They found more systems in various stages of consumption. Some were completely empty, showing only the gravitational signatures of matter that no longer existed. Others contained the twisted remnants of civilizations that had tried to fight back. The worst discovery was a builder beacon system that had been overrun centuries ago. The massive defensive structures were still partially intact, their exotic matter construction having resisted complete dissolution. But they had been corrupted somehow, turned inside out in ways that violated basic geometry. Looking at them, too long caused headaches and nausea, as human brains tried to process impossible shapes. Refugee scholars aboard the fleet worked frantically to understand what they were seeing. The beacon systems had been designed to reinforce local reality against Devourer attacks, creating zones where the laws of physics remained stable. But something had gone wrong during the final battle. Instead of strengthening reality, the corrupted beacons now actively weakened it. The implications were terrifying. If the builders' ultimate weapons had been turned against them, what hope did this ragtag fleet have against such enemies? But humanity's response was characteristically stubborn. Instead of retreating, they began taking detailed scans of every corrupted beacon they encountered. If the Devourers could corrupt builder technology, perhaps the process could be reversed. 3 more weeks passed as the fleet pushed toward the galactic core. Casualties mounted from the environmental hazards alone. Crew members were lost to temporal anomalies that aged them to death in minutes. Others simply vanished when they accidentally entered regions where matter could not exist. The alien crews fared better, their evolved sensitivities allowing them to avoid the worst dangers. But morale remained high despite the losses. Every human who had volunteered for this mission understood they were probably not going home. They were here to gather intelligence, to learn how the Devourers could be fought, and hopefully to find whatever weapons or knowledge the builders had died protecting. The breakthrough came when they reached the edge of the galactic core region. The Harbinger's experimental sensors detected something unprecedented, a region where space-time was not just stable but actively reinforced. It was like finding an island of sanity in an ocean of cosmic madness. Elder Aquinal confirmed what the sensors were showing. They had found the outer edge of the builder's final stronghold, the defensive perimeter that had protected the final archive for millions of years. Somewhere beyond this barrier lay the answers humanity desperately needed. But between the fleet and their destination were Devourers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drawn to this region by the concentration of stable reality. They moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, possibly even strategy. The entities were not just mindless forces of entropy, but something far more dangerous. Thinking beings with goals and plans. Fox stood on the bridge of the Harbinger and watched the enemy that had destroyed countless civilizations. They looked like tears in space itself, dark wounds in reality that leaked impossible geometries. But they were not invincible. The builder defenses were still holding after millions of years, which meant these creatures could be fought and contained. The time for careful reconnaissance was over. The fleet prepared for humanity's first battle against enemies that existed, partially outside the universe itself. Every crew member understood they were about to participate in the galaxy's most desperate gamble. But as Fox looked around the bridge at determined faces, he felt something that had been missing since this nightmare began. Hope. Not for victory, which might be impossible, but for the chance to prove that some species would rather die fighting than live on their knees. The Devourers were about to learn what happened when they tried to consume a species too stubborn to know when they were beaten. The sphere hung in space like a monument to impossibility. It was massive beyond comprehension, easily the size of Earth's moon, but it seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Looking at it hurt in ways that had nothing to do with bright light or physical strain. Human eyes simply were not designed to process something that was simultaneously solid and translucent, near and far, ancient and newly formed. Dr. Pierce pressed her hands against the observation window of the science vessel discovery and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The Builder archive was beautiful in an alien way that made her want to weep. Geometric patterns flowed across its surface like living things, constantly shifting between configurations that followed no earthly mathematics. It was art and science, and something beyond both. The battle to reach this place had cost them dearly. 47 ships lost to Devourer attacks, their crews simply erased from existence when the shadow entities touched their hulls. But the survivors had learned something crucial during those desperate hours of fighting. The Devourers could be hurt, could even be driven back, if you attacked them with weapons that targeted the fundamental forces of reality itself. Commander Fox had proven that when the Harbinger unleashed its experimental weapons for the first time. The quantum disruptors had torn holes in the Devourers' dimensional forms, forcing them to retreat into whatever space they normally inhabited. It was not victory, but it was progress. For the first time in galactic history, someone had made the shadow entities feel pain. Now the combined fleet held defensive positions around the archive, while teams of scientists and engineers prepared to enter the structure. The sphere had responded to their arrival by opening what appeared to be docking ports, though they were clearly designed for beings very different from humans or any of the refugee species. Pierce led the first exploration team into the archive's interior. The airlock sealed behind them with a sound like distant music, and artificial gravity engaged with a gentleness that spoke of technology far beyond anything the galaxy currently possessed. Emergency lighting came online automatically, revealing corridors that stretched away into impossible distances. The walls were covered with symbols that shifted and changed as the team watched. At first, Pierce thought they were looking at some kind of advanced computer display, but closer examination revealed something far stranger. The symbols were carved into the wall material itself, yet they moved like living things. It was as if the entire structure was thinking, processing information at speeds that made human computers seem glacially slow. Engineer Walsh ran his scanner over the nearest wall section and got readings that made no sense. The material registered as both metallic and organic, dense as neutronium yet lighter than air. According to his instruments, it existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, while maintaining perfect structural integrity in normal space. The team moved deeper into the archive, following corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves to guide the visitors toward some central destination. They passed chambers filled with what could only be described as crystallized light, geometric patterns that hung in midair without any visible support. Other rooms contained pools of liquid that reflected scenes from distant star systems, showing civilizations that had thrived and died millions of years ago. But it was the central chamber that took Pierce's breath away. The room was vast beyond measurement, its ceiling lost in shadows that might have been empty space or something more alien. At the center stood a pillar of pure energy that stretched from floor to ceiling, pulsing with colors that had no names in any human language. As the team approached the energy pillar, it began to resonate with a sound like cosmic background radiation, given voice. The frequency bypassed their ears entirely, speaking directly to their minds in ways that made their thoughts feel suddenly larger and more complex. Pierce realized she was not just hearing the pillar but beginning to understand it. The pillar was not just a monument or power source, but a repository of consciousness itself. It contained the collected knowledge and memories of every species the builders had encountered during their millions of years of existence. Every scientific discovery, every work of art, every moment of love or loss experienced by countless civilizations was preserved here in quantum patterns that would outlast the heat death of the universe. Pierce approached the pillar carefully, drawn by an impulse she could not name. When her hand touched the energy field, the universe exploded into her consciousness. For a terrifying moment, she experienced existence from the perspective of beings who had transcended physical form. Eons ago, she saw the galaxy as they had seen it, understood the cosmic forces that shaped reality at its deepest levels. The builders had not been a single species, but a collective consciousness formed from thousands of different civilizations that had chosen to merge their individual existence into something greater. They had made this choice not from desire for power or transcendence, but from desperate necessity when facing enemies that could not be defeated by conventional means. Through the pillar's memories, Pierce witnessed the true horror of the Devourer War. She saw entire galactic arms consumed in decades-long feeding frenzies. She watched civilizations that had stood for millions of years simply cease to exist, as if they had never been born. The Devourers were not evil in any human sense, but they were absolutely unstoppable by any single species fighting alone. But the most disturbing revelation came near the end of the memory transfer. The Devourers were not invaders from another galaxy or dimension. They were the universe's own immune system, triggered into action when the complexity of conscious life reached levels that threatened the stability of reality itself. Civilization, by its very nature, created quantum instabilities that the Devourers were compelled to clean up. The builders had discovered this truth during their final centuries of existence. Every city built, every thought, every emotion felt by conscious beings added to the quantum pressure that would eventually trigger another Devourer awakening. The universe could only support so much complexity before its fundamental structure began to break down. Pierce staggered back from the pillar, her mind reeling from the implications. The builders had faced an impossible choice. They could continue existing as individual consciousness and eventually trigger the destruction of all life in the galaxy, or they could merge into a collective entity that existed in harmony with cosmic forces rather than opposition to them. They had chosen transcendence, abandoning their physical forms to become part of the quantum substrate that underlies all reality. In doing so, they had become the universe's advocates, whispering guidance to younger species across time and space. Every scientific breakthrough, every moral insight that led civilizations away from self-destruction was influenced by builder consciousness working behind the scenes, but their solution had been incomplete. The collective builder consciousness could influence events subtly, but they could not directly intervene in physical reality without risking their own stability. They needed a species willing to take the final step, to make the ultimate sacrifice that would permanently resolve the conflict between consciousness and cosmic order. Pierce shared her discoveries with the rest of the exploration team through direct neural interface with the pillar. The knowledge hit each of them like a physical blow. They were not just fighting for survival, but for the right of consciousness itself to exist in the universe. And according to builder calculations, they were facing a choice that had no good options. They could follow the builder path and transcend physical existence, becoming part of the cosmic background that guided other species toward wisdom. Or they could fight the Devourers directly, knowing that victory would require sacrifices that might destroy everything human about humanity itself. Captain Rivers arrived in the central chamber just as the team was processing these revelations. He took one look at their faces and knew that everything had changed. The mission to find builder weapons had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes and fears. They had found something far more valuable and dangerous than advanced technology. They had found the truth about consciousness, reality, and the price that thinking beings paid for their existence. Now they had to decide what to do with that knowledge, knowing that the wrong choice would doom not just humanity, but every other species in the galaxy to extinction or transcendence. The builders waited in their quantum realm, ready to welcome humanity into their collective consciousness. The Devourers continued their patient advance toward the galactic core, driven by programming older than complex life itself. And somewhere between those two fates, humanity searched for a third option that might not exist. The real test was about to begin. The War Council that would decide the fate of the galaxy met in a converted cargo bay aboard the Defiance. Representatives from every human nation sat alongside alien refugees whose species spanned millions of years of evolution. The air recyclers struggled to accommodate the different atmospheric requirements, creating a slight haze that made the gathering feel dreamlike and unreal. Admiral Stone had aged a decade in the past few hours since receiving Dr. Pierce's report from the archive. The knowledge that consciousness itself was somehow dangerous to universal stability had shaken him more than any enemy fleet could have. How do you fight a war when your very existence is the problem you are trying to solve? Elder Aquinal spoke. First, his melodic voice carrying the weight of his people's ancient wisdom. The Altari had always known this day would come, he explained. Their oldest prophecies spoke of the choice that unmakes, the moment when thinking beings would have to decide whether to preserve themselves or preserve the universe that had given them birth. The builder solution was elegant in its simplicity. Transcend physical existence and become part of the cosmic forces that shaped reality. No more individual suffering, no more conflict between species, no more quantum instabilities that triggered devourer responses. Just pure consciousness existing in harmony with universal law. Dr. Pierce had experienced that state briefly during her contact with the archive. She described it as simultaneously peaceful and terrible, like being dissolved into an ocean of infinite knowledge and compassion. Individual identity became meaningless when you were part of something infinitely larger and more complex than any single mind could comprehend. But Captain Rivers rejected the transcendence option before the discussion had barely begun. His response was viscerally, impossibly human. He would not abandon physical existence no matter how peaceful or wise the alternative might be. Humanity had not clawed its way up from primitive caves just to dissolve into cosmic consciousness when things got difficult. The room erupted in arguments that lasted for hours. Military leaders pointed out that they lacked the technology to fight beings that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Scientists argued that the builder solution was the only logical response to an impossible situation. Some of the refugee representatives accused humanity of suicidal arrogance that would doom every species in the galaxy. But Engineer Rodriguez, quiet as always, raised a point that silenced the debate. She had been studying the technical specifications of the archive's quantum containment systems. The builders had not just transcended to escape the Devourers. They had built a prison, a multi-dimensional cage that had held the shadow entities for millions of years. The containment system was failing, not from external attack but from simple entropy. The quantum barriers that kept the Devourers locked away from the wider galaxy were breaking down after eons of constant stress. Within a few hundred years, maybe less, the prison would collapse entirely and release every devourer that had ever existed back into normal space. Transcendence would not save anyone. It would simply delay the inevitable while leaving younger species defenseless against the coming flood of hungry shadows. The builders had known this, which was why their final messages spoke of hope for a species that would choose the harder path. The harder path, as it turned out, was characteristically human in its stubborn refusal to accept logical limitations. Instead of fighting the Devourers or joining them or transcending beyond their reach, humanity proposed something that had never been attempted before. They would contain the entities permanently through constant active intervention. The plan was insane by any reasonable standard. Using modified builder technology, human volunteers would establish permanent monitoring stations throughout the galactic core region. These watchers would spend eternity in a space where time flowed differently, aging centuries in moments while maintaining the quantum barriers that kept the Devourers imprisoned. It was not victory in any traditional sense. It was an eternal stalemate that would require constant sacrifice from generation after generation of volunteers. Thousands of humans would give up normal life to spend subjective centuries holding the line against cosmic entropy. They would live, age, and die in the service of species they would never meet. Admiral Stone volunteered to lead the first wave of Watchers before anyone else could speak. His decision sparked a flood of volunteers from every ship in the fleet. Pilots, engineers, scientists, Marines. People who had signed up to explore the galaxy now volunteered to spend eternity guarding it instead. The Devourers, for the first time in their existence, encountered something completely outside their programmed parameters. They were designed to consume excess complexity, to clean up quantum instabilities created by conscious thought. But faced with a species that deliberately chose the more complex and difficult path, they simply stopped functioning normally. The Maya shadow entities gathered at the edge of the containment zone, like confused predators facing prey that refused to run or fight back in expected ways. Humanity was not trying to transcend their consciousness or preserve it unchanged. They were transforming it into something new, a form of existence that accepted mortality and suffering as necessary components of protecting others' freedom to live and choose. Dr. Pierce established the first monitoring station 3 days later. The quantum field that allowed her to perceive and manipulate the containment barriers also accelerated her personal timeline dramatically. She would experience decades of subjective time for every hour that passed in normal space, aging rapidly, while maintaining the cosmic cage that protected the galaxy. The work was exhausting beyond description. The Devourers tested every weak point in the containment system constantly, requiring instant responses to prevent catastrophic breaches. Worse, the accelerated time field meant that the Watchers experienced their isolation and duty in slow motion, feeling every moment of separation from the normal world they were protecting. But they endured. When the first shift of Watchers reached the end of their extended lifespans, new volunteers took their places without hesitation. The monitoring stations became a permanent feature of the galactic core, staffed by humans who had chosen to make eternity their enemy rather than death. The galaxy slowly adapted to this new reality. Trade resumed between star systems. Civilizations that had been on the brink of extinction began to rebuild. Children were born who would never know the terror of watching their home systems consumed by shadow entities from beyond normal space. The refugee camps became immigration centers as displaced species found new homes among the stars. The Altaris, bioships, became part of a new generation of hybrid vessels that combined human determination with alien wisdom. The Granite Folk's mathematical insights revolutionized physics, while the Skysinger's quantum sensitivity helped map safe passages through regions still damaged by ancient devourer feeding. But the greatest change was philosophical. Humanity had proven that there was always a third option, even when faced with impossible choices. They had shown that sacrifice and stubborn determination could sometimes achieve what transcendence and surrender could not. Commander Fox, now stationed permanently in the containment zone, sent regular reports back to normal space. His messages spoke of beauty as well as duty, the strange aurora effects created by dimensional barriers, the peaceful moments between crisis responses when the monitoring teams could simply exist together in their quantum prison. His final recorded message became famous throughout human space. Standing in an observation chamber while reality flickered around him like a damaged video screen, Fox spoke directly to the camera with eyes that had seen centuries pass in months. "We are the species that looked at infinity and chose the hard," he said quietly. "We are the ones who said not today to entropy itself, and we will keep saying it, for as long as there are stars to protect and dreams to defend. We march with death not as its servants, but as companions who refuse to let it have the final word." The transmission ended, but the work continued. Across the galaxy, species that had never heard of Earth told stories of the stubborn humans who had chosen eternal vigilance over eternal peace. The universe was safe not because humanity was the strongest or the smartest, but because they were the most impossibly, magnificently unwilling to accept defeat. In the quantum laboratories where time flowed like honey and space bent into impossible shapes, The watchers stood their posts and smiled. They had found something worth an eternity of sacrifice. They had found the proof that consciousness could coexist with cosmic order if someone was willing to pay the price. The price was everything. Human, the reward was everything else.